video. So let me bring in our opening presentation from Rebekah Gudeman, who's the managing director of media agency FP1, which works for many Republican campaigns and advocacy groups. They learned a lot in the last 2 cycles, especially about using digital video channels like YouTube and Facebook when local TV and OTT markets were cost prohibitive. She's going to kick off this section about video, sharing some of the best practices and the learnings that they got from doing the digital video media dance. Before coming to FP1, Rebekah was a digital analyst for the NRCC and worked in Senator Mark Kirk's office. Rebekah, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Steve. Thank you for having me this morning.
Thank you. Are you down in DC? Are you freezing like the rest of us on the East Coast?
I am. I was sad not to get any snow yesterday, though. Even though we're all working from home, there is that excitement of having a snow day still.
You're with my wife. She's dying for a snow in. I don't know why, because it means she's stuck with me. But
there you go.
Rebekah, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you share your screen, and we will start it off.
Awesome. Sounds great. Thank you. To everyone who is joining us again for day 2, welcome. And it is great to see so many names. I wish that we were able to do this in person, but even though we are virtual, looking to make this as much of a conversation as possible. So please throughout put your questions and feedback in the Zoom chat, and that way at the end, we can make sure to go through some Q&As too. But when diving into the streaming battle lines going into 2022, I think it's important to start back in 2020 and review some of the big takeaways that we saw coming out of last cycle and how that is changing the environment. In 2020, we saw a tremendous amount of belt tightening as Americans were going into year 2 of the pandemic. They were cutting costs, and with it, they were cutting the cable cord. And in 2020, an estimated 10% of US households ended up cutting the cable cord and shifted a lot of that attention to more cost-efficient streaming alternatives. It's estimated that between March and June of 2020, so just a 3-month period, streaming consumption increased by 220%. And that has not slowed down at all going into 2021. Last year, for the very first time, the number of US households that could be reached with OTT devices surpassed that of the households reached with cable. So you saw 87 million OTT households being able to be reached with OTT devices compared to 74 million households with cable. And amongst the OTT contingent, ad-supported inventory is the fastest growing cohort. So that's a tremendous opportunity, not only for brand advertisers, but specifically for political, as we are looking to build out our plans for 2022. I think it's important on this topic and on this slide to also highlight, I know going into last year, a lot of media skeptics were saying maybe Americans would tire, going into the 3rd year of the pandemic of that high amount of consumption, and they would want to stop streaming and want to break quarantine and go outdoors. And I know we can all relate, but the numbers are really showing otherwise. So even though from 2020 to 2021, you saw a smaller increase in the amount of time people were spending streaming content every day, it's still continuing to tick up slowly but surely year over year. So that's a tremendous opportunity for advertisers to not only take advantage of more streaming inventory sources, but just the tremendous reach of this medium and the amount of time that Americans are spending consuming it every single day. The rise of ad-supported streaming is really changing where advertisers need to look for voters. And so as we're building our 2022 plans, it's important to build them with that in mind and really think towards where our voters, where the individual audiences we want to target are consuming the most content to be effective and cost efficient. So you have this growing inventory source. You see streaming continue to increase as an important medium for plans, but how do advertisers take the most advantage of this inventory source? How do they leverage it to the fullest potential, especially when looking at elections? And I believe, and our team is really focused on the answer here being breaking down the traditional barriers that have in previous election cycles existed between TV buying and digital buying. And it's understandable barriers where you have the segmented budgets, and up until the breakthrough of streaming, there were very different approaches to these two different channels, and they were really isolated in their individual spheres. But streaming is acting like that bridge between the two mediums. It's really pulling them together. And the most effective media plans and advertisers in 2022 will be the ones that consolidate their buying efforts. They don't view it as TV budget versus digital budget. They put it together, and they really focus instead on an audience-based buying approach. And that translates into your plans in two ways. First, you are considering your message weight amongst your target audience across all of the channels combined, instead of looking at here's my message weight for TV and here's my message weight for digital, and breaking it out that way. And by looking at the message weight that you have across all of these channels combined, you're able to leverage better cost efficiencies. So in cost prohibitive media markets for cable, you can tap into streaming and some of the cable alternatives that we'll discuss a little bit later. Whereas in markets with very high cable penetration, you can leverage that medium and supplement digital to really impact and reach cord cutters. So by looking at it from an audience-based approach and considering your message weight across all of these channels, it's really going to unlock that next step of cost efficiencies and deduplicated efforts. And that leads into the second benefit of this approach to building your media plans, which is that you have a more strategic and a cleaner message progression. If you are looking solely at message progression by medium instead of combined, you're missing oversaturation of some audience members on one medium and a potential undersaturation of other audiences on another medium. So for example, you could deliver 1,000 GRPs on broadcast and reach your audience with one message in a week. But then comparatively on digital, it might take you 2 or 3 weeks to deliver a full message there. But you're missing out, unless you're doing this full cross-channel planning, on the fact that you have saturated this audience. It's important for your message progression to move on to the next message or creative that you have, and to really build that consistent flow across all of the channels. So really looking at the streaming impact from 2020, leading again into 2022, how that's continuing to expand. As buyers, we need to build our plans with a cross-channel audience-based mindset to really maximize the scale that we have in this new environment, and also minimize redundancies and duplicative efforts that can hurt our budgets and hurt our effectiveness. Looking ahead to 2022, as I mentioned previously, the most effective plans will be those that approach TV and digital together with an audience-based buying mindset. So we've talked a lot so far about streaming, how great it is, how much it is growing, and how advertisers would be remiss not to fully take advantage of this opportunity. But that is not to say that it is a perfect solution. It is by no means a silver bullet. And as advertisers, there are key obstacles and areas that we need to be aware of going into 2022 to make sure that we're not taken advantage of. The first being measurement and tech. So OTT and streaming has really unlocked this new dimension of fraud. We have to consider things like, is an OTT device still playing even when the TV is turned off? Or is a streaming menu maybe interfering with the ad placement or obscuring it? Or is the HDMI cable not connected from the device to the TV screen? So it's all of these new obstacles that we did not run into with traditional pre-roll, but they need to be monitored and they need to be measured. There are some great solutions out in the space from Moat and IAS for viewability and fraud tracking. Nielsen also relaunched their streaming suite in October of 2021, so really excited to test that out and use that for some of the deduplicated reach measurement and the audience paneling measurement. But this is something that advertisers need to be mindful of as they're building their media plans, going to trusted inventory sources, leveraging the tech that we do have available in order to make smart buys, and continuing to push partners to move in this direction of updated fraud prevention, updated fraud tracking, and some of the additional measurement and technologies that we have grown accustomed to and really expect in the digital space. The second obstacle to really keep an eye out for is inventory quality. As this area has grown, so too have the actors looking to take advantage of it. So it's really important to go in eyes wide open, to buy as close to the source as possible so you are not paying a premium for lower quality inventory. And this goes hand in hand with measurement. It goes hand in hand with tech, just making sure that you are being smart with where you are putting your dollars and not treating all OTT the same. And the third obstacle to really keep in mind is frequency control. So really it began in 2020, I think really in 2021, we saw how increasingly fragmented the OTT space is. And Roku did a really interesting study at the end of 2021. And they found that the number of streaming devices and platforms that users had increased 27% last year. So on average now, when you're talking about an individual voter, they have almost on average, 9 streaming platforms or services that they pull from on any given day. And that's a combination of ad-supported streaming subscriptions, non-ad supported streaming subscriptions, the free streaming subscriptions as well. And so that's something that advertisers need to keep in mind, taking advantage of this fragmented space and really focusing in on that audience buying mentality, but also working to track frequency across these streaming partners come together. So that way you're not just looking at your frequency on Hulu versus a frequency on Fox versus a frequency on Peacock, but you're looking holistically at, okay, what is my frequency across all of these OTT sources on one individual? And that's going to be key to making sure that you are fully reaching your offline audiences and doing so at an appropriate weight throughout. I've spent a lot of time talking so far on streaming, and rightfully so. It's really come to the forefront of advertising, and especially political advertising, but quietly growing in the background but equivalent in both scale and impact is the improvement of cable alternatives. And when I talk about cable alternatives, I am talking specifically about YouTube and a number of the offerings that Google has incorporated into this platform. So what's really interesting is that going into 2022, YouTube reaches more eyeballs than Netflix. And that's impressive because it's really dominating the streaming space. And what's noteworthy here too is that the share of impressions that YouTube is serving on connected TV devices continues to increase as well. So at the end of 2020, we saw about 30% of impressions for any given video campaign on YouTube were served on a CTV device. That's just continuing to tick up slowly but surely to the 40% rate. And I only see that continuing to grow. But more impressive just than YouTube's dominance of the streaming space is their ability to rival cable for reach in key markets. It's an important tool to leverage in cost prohibitive cable markets. It's an equally important tool to leverage in low cable penetration markets. And it's something that our team put to the test in coordination with Google going into the 2020 elections. We were playing in a competitive purple state, and there was a very expensive media market there where when we were doing our planning in Q1 of 2020, the cost per cable point was estimated to be well over $2,000 by the Q4 of 2020 when we would be really gearing up towards election day. So what we did is we worked with the YouTube team to determine how many of the users reached by cable we could also reach on YouTube. And then the next step was making an equivalent cost per cable point for YouTube. And in translating the CPM to the CPP, we found that YouTube had an equivalent cost per cable point of $88. And this is compared to the projected cable costs of over $2,000 per point. So with that in mind and building this true cross-channel media buy, we took 30% of our cable budget and shifted it only to YouTube. And in doing so and moving that 30% of the cable budget, we increased voter contact and our TRPs by 50%. This is a trend that is not isolated just to this competitive state. It's something that we see time and time again in some of the most expensive cable markets. And it ties back to what we talked about previously, which is that to really leverage the benefit of streaming and leverage the benefit of cable alternatives, you need to approach the table with this audience-based buying mentality and not isolating budget by medium or by channel, but looking for those cost efficiencies. I would be remiss not to talk about some of the amazing lift measurements that YouTube offers, their brand lift, search lift, awareness mix. And I want to make sure to leave plenty of times for questions at the end, but really you could get me talking all day about YouTube. I think it's a really important thing for advertisers to take advantage of. Cable alternatives are giving planners a way to increase voter contact for less. And it's something that we need to be mindful of with our plans. I want to touch quickly on social. They have not been as quiet in the background, certainly not to the level of some of these cable alternative growth. They've been capturing attention for the other reason with political advertising, and that is the increasingly cumbersome and nuanced regulations that social, specifically Facebook, is putting on political advertisers. It's something that going into 2022, we need to go in eyes wide open about, build smart contingencies, leverage Facebook for what it's good at, which is micro-targeting, but with a smaller portion of the budget, and really focus on in-stream inventory on Facebook. If you are buying newsfeed inventory or marketplace inventory with your video ads, you are wasting money on inventory that is low quality and not skippable. So really, focus on the streaming, focus on the cable alternatives. Social is important. We should continue to leverage it to the extent that we can, fully anticipating changes before Election Day and not putting too many eggs in that basket because you really cannot put all of your eggs in one digital basket. And that certainly applies to social. I want to touch on, last but not least, and certainly a key part of this conversation, we've talked a lot about finding the right inventory source mix in order to build a competitive media plan. But what goes hand in hand with that is your audience targeting. And the rise of streaming has really forced the conversation for media buyers away from micro-targeting, which was certainly an important value prop for digital when it first came onto the scene. But increasingly, as we're looking at streaming and cable alternatives where micro-targeting is not a viable option right now, and I don't foresee it becoming a true viable option, looking at how you can target still smart based off of the content and the channels that users are consuming, and in a cost-efficient way. So one thing that our team always breaks down for all of our campaigns and all of our plans is the cost per completed second, looking at how much it costs for every viewed second on a specific platform. And that way you can compare apples to apples between a Facebook, a Hulu, and a YouTube. And what we found with this is that compared to Facebook, a Hulu ad can miss your audience 9 out of every 10 times it is served and still be more cost efficient. So as advertisers, as we're building our plans going into 2022, it's important to still leverage micro-targeting, but also understand that that micro-targeted list is a means to the audience in the same way that content targeting and strong demo targeting are also a means to the audience. And it's evaluating the cost efficiencies there to really hone in on where we can find the arbitrage opportunities and really take the lead on the battle lines of the streaming world. So with that, I feel like we've only scratched the surface this morning of some of the really big pieces coming into play for 2022. There is a lot of exciting innovation and advancement on the horizon. And I think that the best advertisers next cycle will be the ones that remain nimble, that test every idea and don't take any presumption for granted, and that build contingencies in this space too. And what I love about political advertising especially is that I know we've talked a lot about streaming and some of the new things we're seeing right now, but a year from now, there's going to be new channels, inventory sources, tools that we're talking about that aren't even on the radar right now. And that's going to be a lot of fun. So with that, Steve, I want to answer any questions that have come up so far. Would love to open it up to folks and see what we have in the queue.
We've got some, and I also want to, ask you to stick around for the panel too, because we'll get you to ask some questions of the panel, because I think we're going to be extending this into that too. So awesome. By the way, since you mentioned things that are on the horizon, we talked briefly yesterday with Patrick at the DNC about TikTok. So where do you fit TikTok, which has a massive audience, which some would argue is larger than some of the digital other bigger name digital providers right now? Where do you fit that into your matrix, and how are you starting to figure in TikTok as a player in the video space?
Absolutely. So there is an interesting stat that came around. If you're not subscribed to State of the Screens, you should absolutely do that. They sent out an interesting metric last week, and it was talking about the growth of user-generated content. So like what you see on TikTok, and how that was expected to surpass some of the studio created content that you see on, say, a Netflix or a Hulu. And I think that's something really important for advertisers to take hold of. Maybe not immediately for 2022. I think it will start to creep onto the playing field, similar to how you see streaming creep on the playing field in 2018 and then really take off in 2020. But looking ahead to the next, to the 2024 election, we should absolutely be looking for advertising opportunities on user-generated content. I would also add a flag here too. I think TikTok's important if that is the audience base that you are going after. Mm-hmm. And so it's really about buying with your audience in mind and what inventory are they consuming? Are they on TikTok? Perhaps for the left, yes. I think for the right, maybe a little bit less so, but kind of moving in that direction. And so it's something to be mindful of and kind of think through those contingencies to be nimble still too.
We have a good question about where most campaigns are, through what medium are most campaigns buying from these streaming providers? Are they doing it mainly through agencies and their existing relationships, or are they dealing direct with the platforms?
Yeah, so for all of our candidates and advocacy and issue groups that we work with, we do a combination. So we will do a combination of buys directly with individual publishers and inventory sources. And then we will also lean into, there's some amazing DSPs out there. I would say the Trade Desk is absolutely at the forefront of that. These aggregators that will pull the different publisher and inventory sources together to really maximize your time and allow you to capture a lot of the different streaming options in one go. And when you're using a DSP solution like the Trade Desk, what's really beneficial there is that they have more frequency capping solutions to kind of fix the obstacle that I raised under streaming, one of the ones for advertisers to be mindful of controlling frequency across all of these different sources.
You started out at the top of your deck, you talked about overall growth in streaming and the share that it's grabbing from cable and broadcast. How does that, in your experience, how does that vary from region to region though? When you go into a particular state race or even a district race, are you seeing very different sets of behaviors? How are you determining that? And how much of a variance is there across the country in terms of share of viewing time going to streaming?
Yeah, that's an absolutely important context piece to keep in mind with streaming. What we have experienced is in 2018, I think there was a greater disparity. So in 2018, we were playing in Montana, and you obviously in Montana saw very limited streaming reach, and some of the more traditional broadcast and cable mediums were stronger solutions there, versus some of the more metropolitan marketplaces where you would have significant reach with these streaming services. I would say that in 2020, we saw that even out more. But our first question whenever we go to a publisher or an inventory source is, what's your max reach against this offline audience that we have? And then selecting the publishers and the inventory sources based off of who can most closely align with that offline target.
Rebekah, thank you so much. This was a great setup for our next discussion. So stick around for it and we'll pull you into it too.
Awesome.
Okay, thanks, Rebekah.